Thank you, everybody, again, for coming, and for those who are watching on the video we're recording, to this iteration of the Movement Matters Symposia series. This program, for those who don't know, investigates work at the intersection of dance, performance, politics, policy, and issues related to the body. And for this particular instance of the series, we have with us artists and writers who contribute to and edited and curated various sections from the Bridge Journal. So we're here to discuss how their work for the current volume relates to its overarching themes, including the role of artists around the world in agitating for democracy and social justice, the Assembly Zones Initiative, which we've been talking about today, and more. And I'm going to pass around an invitation to introduce themselves to each of our panelists, because the bios got lost in the ether, as it were. So we'll start at the end here with Michelle, if you have a mic there. Make sure it's turned on, and you should be able to take it from there.
Hello. Okay, yeah. It is turned on. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Kraniki. I am the artistic director of Zephyr, which is an experimental dance and performance company. Been around in Chicago for close to 30 years. And I am also co-director with my husband, who's at the other end, of Sightless, which is an experimental performance architecture and research gallery in Chicago. And dance editor and contributor to Bridge. Very happy to be here.
I'm Ionit Behar. I'm the assistant curator at DePaul Art Museum and also a PhD candidate in art history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I am from Uruguay, but I've been in Chicago for 10 years this August.
Hi, I hope you don't mind me wearing sunglasses. I don't mean to block myself, but it's really bright. My name is Dianna Frid. I am an artist. I am also an educator. I teach at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where I will be soon promoted to professor. And I was born in Mexico City. My family immigrated to Canada, and I've lived in Chicago longer than anywhere else. So thanks for coming.
It's okay, it's in front. Yeah, I'm Dave Sundry. I'm a graduate of Notre Dame and Pratt Institute. I'm an architect as well as a contractor. I have a design-build company, so we design and build our projects. I guess I'm the architectural editor of Bridge, and I've been practicing in Chicago for the last 30 years.
Right, so we, in the run-up to this, formulated our list of questions in advance, so we're just going to go right from that. And we're going to start with the question already on the floor. In the statement for this Artists Roundtable, how you each see artists agitating for democracy and social justice, the Assembly Zones Initiative, and more, and break that into a few parts. Starting with, let's start with you as the visual art curator of the current volume. Maybe we have a little bit of a discussion of the language aspects of the activism and survival strategy work of artists you selected for it. I know that there's a copy there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Michael, also for inviting me to contribute with a text and a sort of curatorial exhibition on the page, a selection of artists, also to Andrew Schachman, who's generally the visual arts editor who invited me. So as Michael mentioned, I contributed a text and a selection of 16 artists, 16 artworks that are distributed along the new issue of Bridge, with the center main focus of my idea, artists that work with language in all sorts of ways. And I selected, as I said, 16 artists that are coming from different times, different countries, different identities, and work very differently with language. And sort of the selection is very open-ended. I don't necessarily go into each of the artworks with the idea that also seeing the works in bridge will be a sort of reading. So I guess I would say that, and perhaps I'll give one example, which is the first example that appears that you can see here by the artist Margarita Paxa. She was an Argentinian conceptual artist who, that's the focus of my research for my PhD, but the work I selected is a 1973 artwork that reads in Spanish, "Me cortaron las manos," which translates to "they cut off my hands." And it's a work that she dedicates and also does in response to the murder of poet and musician Victor Hara, a Chilean artist and activist. And she makes this work in response to that. I won't get too much into who Victor Hara was, but basically just to tell you that this was happening during dictatorship, not just in Chile, but Paxa herself was living it in her own country, in Argentina, a dictatorship that lasted from 68 to 83. So many years in her sort of development of artistic practice and her trying to figure it out what to do, how to be an artist in those difficult times. And so I guess I would just say one more thing, which is the rest of the artworks, which are all contemporary from the past few years. Many of them are from 2016 to 2020, kind of, pointing to a particular political context. That I had in mind selecting these artworks, also having this question in mind, the same question that Paxa had in mind. How can we keep making artworks? In what ways? With what materials? And how? Anyway, that's my response to that.
Yeah, and I think this is a great segue into.
Yes.
to
So Dianna is one of the 16 artists that I selected, and so I will let you talk about your work in this series, which is the obituaries from the New York Times. Just one of them, right?
Thank you. Yeah, just a segue to Victor Hara. I grew up in Mexico City, and we all knew that Victor Hara was an important poet and musician. His music is so beautiful, so you can find it in Spotify. But his hands were cut off, and that was, something atrocious that was done to a very important protest musician. I mean, in Spanish you call it música de protesta. The piece that Ionit selected for Bridge, it's from the Words from Obituary Series, and it is now on view at the DePaul Art Museum. There's another piece on view at the DePaul Art Museum. And the two pieces at the DePaul Art Museum are New York, based on, or not based, they're works extracted from the New York Times obituaries of two Cubans. One of them being a dissident who was actually a terrorist who used bombs to kill Cubans, and the other one, Armando Hart, who is the one featured in the publication. He was a colleague of Castro's and worked in education. So it's really interesting that they're together at the DePaul, because one of them is saying, is addressing bombs, and the other one is addressing something else. And I can tell you what it says, but what I'm interested in these pieces, the obituary series is everybody dies. Not everybody gets to have an obituary in the New York Times, and not everybody has the same death. I don't think of death as an equalizer, because some people have horrible deaths that don't get, and the rituals around their death are not respectful. But everybody does die. And the New York Times, from all of the Latin American countries, it has published more long-form obituaries of Cubans or Cuban Americans, which is an interesting observation. I'm not a statistician. I don't know if I'm giving you a factual, if this is a fact, but this is my perception. So it does point to I guess, a register of the New York Times addressing the politics of Latin America, at least of a dissident small country like Cuba. My series it has many different registers because some of the people who die are, in my view, have done amazing things, and some people are war criminals. And I choose the obituaries for what I can find in them. So the words are taken out of the context. Words don't belong to anyone. Syntax does, but I take them out of the context, and they still operate in a particular way. So the one in the magazine, in the publication, it says, "You send us bombs," but it can also say, "You send US bombs." And because I don't use any punctuation or space between the words, or sometimes the phrases end in between words, there's a thing that happens where the constituent parts of the text are the letters. And every letter is in a different shade of a given color. And I mean, it gets a little bit more, I don't know, I can talk more about it if people are interested, because there's a system behind this work. And for me, as an artist, I work in different ways, sometimes with a system, sometimes more, I guess, instinctively. And that's what I need. I need to work in more than one way. But if as a viewer, if you don't know the system, you can still have an experience of a work. Because even if my work uses language, it exceeds it, I hope. There's sensuality, there's color, there's form, and then there is, of course, the linguistic aspect of it too, which I'm more interested in the poetics of it than in the factual experience of it.
Yeah, like I said, there's this built-in indeterminacy to the language, and you're talking about people who you're both in some way trying to valorize in some instances and recognize in other. I've always thought it was a fascinating sort of balance in the language work. But to move it to this next question, then, Dave, you in our conversations, you frequently referenced out of the night and playground concepts in our conversations about your dance set pieces for allowances and occurrences, which is are the set pieces which are forming the basis for the adaptive process of the assembly zones, for those who aren't aware of that. I thought about it a lot, and I was interested to ask you if you could elaborate on the line you see between that work and how you both, in your essay, integrate the historicities of these sort of fascistic architectures. I know we're talking about the Berlin Wall and how it was built over time, and how that connects with how you may have been thinking about these set pieces and how they're formed or put together, and the design process that came together in your essay for the journal.
Oh yeah, sure. It's Michael chose a piece that Michelle and I did in one of her shows called Allowance and Occurrences about 10 years ago as kind of a basis to start the design process for assembly zones. I think later part of it might be assembled in the lobby there. It's probably a little bit difficult to describe it now, but essentially it was kind of an elaborate kind of, maybe I have some language here, might help. It was a kind of constructed landscape incorporating elements of seating, bleachers, stage, gallery, display, an urban garden that served as a performance arena, an opportunity for increased visibility and viewing options for the audience. And one of the things that I think Michael liked about it was the way Michelle and I worked on this. We put the piece in the absolute center of the gallery. So there was actually almost no leftover space. Any leftover space around the installation, the environment, was almost for exiting and arrival. And there was therefore no other accommodation for seating. So therefore, any audience member that came in had to utilize the set or the environment. And we didn't dictate or announce. We didn't have docents. We didn't want to interrupt the flow of the piece. We didn't want it to be regulated. We didn't want it to be antagonistic, and we didn't want it to be filled with instructions. So what happened is what we had hoped for and did occur at times was this kind of, where sometimes in performance, site-specific performance pieces, sometimes things happens where the audience is kind of forced against the wall, you know, and they feel like they're in the way. Or maybe the audience and the performers are cohabitating or mingling, and all of a sudden the performers kind of rush onto the set itself, and I kind of, and there's this mass exodus of the audience to the side, like I call it, like the bulls at Pamplona, where they're unreleased down this narrow space and everyone runs for cover. And you know, conversely, then there's a lot of foreshadowed instructions and docents and stratagems, I guess would be the word, that we think interrupt the flow or the ambiance of the piece. And we started to ask ourselves, you know, if we have to do all these instructional, pre-regulated, you know, cues, is this piece not therefore failing forward? So therefore, we did this in the center, and what Michelle and I tried to do was to make it, is to use a lot of complex shifts to try to create a grammar. So we created a grammar of parts that were relatable with a repeatable construction language, which is also about cost and constructability, and something important to architecture. But it was something that we felt could be very subtle, and it could create this kind of interconnected lattice with a lot of possibilities for the audience to read the performers. And instead of these changes, they could subtly shift or scooch or adjust. And there were many intuitive ways we hoped that people could read the situation, and therefore this kind of group accommodation could occur. So I think Michael was interested in that, am I not mistaken? And one of the things that we also tried to do in it was we tried to position the audience within the work itself that was displayed upon the seating pedestals, and this interchangeability of the audience performer was further integrated as these separate identities struggled for an overlap in what's called this limited working space. And working space is a common term, but I'm particularly interested in it. It comes from a book by Frank Stella he wrote in the early 80s. And it was a way for him, he was the arch modernist, flat, like heroic modernist painter that made the most formally, the term is autotelic, but self-reflexive work that was all about the work itself, just self-integrated logical paintings. And as he's tried in the early 80s to try to start to build these self-contained works out to the audience and the space again, it was about this negotiation as his work approached the condition of sculpture. So one thing that happened within these was that the audience and the performers mingle together. The audience not only starts to survey the performer, but they start to survey themselves. So the performer gets wrapped up in the viewing of the piece, and at times there's a fluidity, or at times there's just self-consciousness. But I think what we tried to do was take that and draw that forward into assembly zones where we have to do this with public/private space. Maybe a quick thing on Otto van Eyck. Yeah. Otto van Eyck was a mid-century modern architect. He's Dutch, very conceptually forward-thinking guy. He was responding to the second phase of architectural modernism, where he was trying to humanize it. And one of his problems was that since Amsterdam and Rotterdam, most of Denmark was the Netherlands was so devastatingly bombed, the initial rush to build up the cities was in terms of like almost cynical, rational, inexpensive construction, apartment buildings, typical forms that were actually obliterating what was left of the 19th century city that had been devastated in World War II. And he got this idea not only to create buildings that were more like cityscapes unto themselves, much like the lattice that we created for this allowances set with my wife, but it was also about trying to keep these spaces open for playgrounds and ways for some of the bomb sites to create aspects of the city that had been destroyed and not have it lost forever. And he had this notion of the idea of the in-between. And so I think Michelle and I were trying to draw on the idea of the in-between as this nuanced space where the audience and the performers could start to read each other. And there was more, instead of it being instructional, we were trying to get a grammar that there was a kind of tacit understanding, and trying to build that up, which means that you fail, but then you start again and you make it successful. And the point is you commit to it and you keep going forward. And one other reason about the playgrounds that interests me is that they're children. And sometimes the best read of architecture is kids, because there are no rules for them. And they go in there and sometimes they have the most novel, fresh interpretations. And that's always been my interest, and that was something that I think Michelle and I were trying to achieve with this set and for your upcoming project.
Well, turn to Michelle, I wanted to note this, that you are the first person to be a symposium member twice, so welcome back. Michelle was in our very first Moving Matters symposium at High Concept Labs on dance and criticism. But to take from what Dave was saying, the phrase work for allowances and occurrences, I thought was I read it as about time, transition, and sculptural monument. Became very active and mysterious throughout the performance. Can you discuss what degree your dance practice in that and subsequent work also operates in this kind of zone of vocabulary, and how that translates into social commentary or agitation as well? It's a big
It's a big question.
Yeah.
So, my work unfolds over a long period of time. I've shortened it in the past few years, but at the beginning, about 10 years ago, when I was kind of shifting my artistic practice from a proscenium-based stage way of looking at dance to one that was much more sculptural, one that was much more about an audience member having a lot of choice and agency in how they looked at the dance. I also began by creating very long durational works. And those works are built up over a period of time. They use gesture, movement, responding to the atmosphere and the architecture. One of the things that I was very interested in, and probably because Dave and I are married, and for 10 years before that, he'd been advising me a little bit on the visual aspects, since he's a visual artist as well, of movement and the architectural aspects of it. We became very interested in working together and making the atmosphere of the space an integral part of the dance. So the texture of the movement, building up over a long period of time, creating an atmosphere within the architectural construction is very important to me. And there's a filmmaker named Andrei Tarkovsky. He's Russian, and his films are not for the faint of heart. You must definitely be in for the long term, because generally they're quite long. But I've always found them to be extraordinarily satisfying. When you make it to the end, they tend to be very beautiful and imagistic, and that's kind of the way I approach my own dance making, in hopes that a long, slow build will ultimately give a reward at the end, the person who's taken the time to engage with the work and be in it. As far as like social commentary and agitation, I guess I want to read a quote that I used in my article by Claire Bishop. No, excuse me, this is Hal Foster, not Claire Bishop. And he says that when dance, as dance becomes subservient or instrumental to a larger political, moral, or social idea, neither side wins. And Hal says, because it might release a given artist from the criterion of either social effectivity or artistic invention, or the criterion becomes the alibi for the other, with any pressure from the social side dismissed as sociological, and any pressure from the artistic side as aestheticist. And when I read that, I really, it really resonated with me, that statement, because I don't set up to make social commentary or agitate with the work. I am interested in aesthetics. I'm interested in the art itself, and what the viewer brings to that. And the social commentary or the agitation comes from the aesthetic element of the work, and not necessarily the specific social idea. Because it's like a soup kitchen. Why make a work about a soup kitchen? Just go make a soup kitchen. I think art has a job in and of itself, and once we begin trying to pigeonhole it and force it into becoming something that it's not, then there's a little bit of a loss about what makes it extraordinary. So again, as I build my own work, and I work with my husband in a very architectural, sculptural, gestural, formal way, I rely on the formalism of the discipline to create the work, and then the social commentary or the agitation that might accompany it is, it accompanies it on its own terms without being imposed through the art upon it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, and I think there's just a really interesting history around formalism in that context too. I mean, but to turn it back to David, in your essay for the volume, you know, your work to break down the ways in which art has been subsumed to various other disciplines and practices. You're trying to show how often that happens with, when it has nothing to do with the art. This seems to me a continuation of the devaluation of art within these contexts as you situate it, drawing a line from Claire Bishop's The Social Turn and the autotelic nature of art, and you pulling on from Hal Foster there, you know, his statement about art's ability to reconstitute reality as a whole. Now, as a former student, we talked about this some, Foster, could you unpack that line and the rest for us?
Yeah. I think look, one of the things that Michelle and I are trying to do at Sightless was, you know, in the last, say, 30 years, this started to become big in the 80s, probably in the 70s actually, when interdisciplinary work, and I think rightfully and historically so, started to emerge. And it was radical at that time. I mean, it was transgressive, it was historically necessary, you know, something that was autonomous but became too closed down, ceased to be able to become a vehicle to carry meaning in the same way. But one could flip ahead to 2020, where now we've probably had social practice art for 20 years, with that interdisciplinary art for almost 40 or 50. One could say that a reverse moment has occurred, you know? It's kind of like mannerism. It's an inversion of values. And it seems like every 50 years, one side becomes the other and they flip. It's an odd human evolution of like intellectual thought. And one thing at Sightless was, again, our practice is inherently interdisciplinary. You know, I can't think of anything on two different durational time scales, from immediate to long-term and from cost, than architecture and dance. But regardless, so what it was trying to do was to reapproach and re-understand the edges of disciplines, try to reclaim some of the histories of the various disciplines, cinema, sculpture, painting, etc., strip them back a little bit, create edges on those disciplines, get the histories right in order to build them back up. It's not to say this, not that, or say something's bad. It was to kind of strip it back so you could open a gap, another space to critically rethink it. And that's one of the things that is talked about in this article, the fascistic, is I take the idea of the Berlin Wall, and I note that historically there wasn't one Berlin Wall, there was almost two. And there was the one that we know of, the concrete beautiful concrete panels with the round tube on top. But it started really as a line of guards, and then it became a fence, and then it became a chain link fence, and then suddenly one night it became a bunch of cinder block walls and bricked in windows in existing buildings, so the back of your building might be boarded up. The front's in West Berlin and the back, the front's in East Berlin and the back's in the West, so you can't go out your back window. And then what I meditated on was this little space between the Berlin walls. And my kind of contribution to it was, I called that the free zone. It was, you had, whatever side you're on, it was almost like you could say there was two competing ideologies. There was the West on one side and the communist motion, and that pretty much encapsulated almost the whole world. And the one space, the free zone, was the gap between the walls, which might be 20 feet down to 6 inches. And I tried to meditate and use that as a reflective way to look at art as the free zone. How does art, in contradistinction to a lot of other disciplines like science, anthropology, education, etc., economics, how can art, which I think is its own distinct discipline, maintain that free zone of reflective judgment so we could use that free play that's in between morality and reason to rethink and have it go out and therefore influence the other disciplines, science, etc. And so one of the things that I talk about in there is I say, look, for instance, in science, scientists have to be very careful to make narrow, secure, narrowly constructed arguments. They have to be very careful about causality, and they have to be reputable. They have to be testable so that that knowledge can truly be shared. And Michelle and I's problem is that as people start to make scientific or data claims or anthropological soft science claims, education, therapy, and anthropological claims for art, art starts to lose its special place because at the end of the day, it is its own form of thinking. And and the point is as soon as you have an art piece that, let's say, nails down a data set, you paint a wall green and this happens, and it's testable, it will no longer be an art statement, it'll be a science statement. Trust me, science will grab it, it will be in their journals, and they'll call it science. They won't call it art, they'll call it science. So that's just kind of the turf war between disciplines, and there's good reason for that. But I think art, or let's say judgment, art is a division of judgment in Kant's philosophy. Judgment and reflection and art is a special way of thinking about this, and I think I insist a lot in trying to maintain that gap.
Michelle, going back to you again, taking from this question, you cite Bishop in your essay as well, where she states, without antagonism, there is only the imposed consensus of the authoritarian order. In this section of the essay, you're asserting the benefits and necessity of an artistic and dispassionate stance toward the process of dance making, which we've been discussing a lot here. But to what degree is this seemingly internal stance a matter of standing outside the impositions of society and its received wisdoms then?
So I'm going to start by reading something from my article again, and it's by the artist Thomas Hirschhorn, and he says, "What is needed is not a means to make political art, but to make art politically, where real formal decisions regarding a work's construction or decisions involving a work's format, materials, and location, and the discipline's internal grammar and history are necessary and inseparable from the political message of the work. This reassertion of the autonomy of artistic activity." And I read your question a lot, and I've been thinking about it a lot the past couple of days because I feel, when I once again read this statement by Thomas Hirschhorn, it resonates with me really viscerally because to make art is a political act. Like if you are going to be involved in aesthetic grammar and within the formal parameters of that grammar, it is a political act for many reasons. Because art has the capacity to allow society to reflect on itself. Because when art is successful, people actually come, view something, watch something, and then can have a different perspective. That doesn't necessarily mean that the art itself has to have a political message. It just has to work well within its formal constraints. And the thing about it is when that happens and when that works, you aren't stepping outside of the social aspect of it. You actually are in it. It comes into it through its own mechanisms, through its own way of thinking, through its own internal inner workings. And I think that making art is a political act. Whether or not your art is political, is politically, the message is political, that's what I wanted to say. And so I'm very committed to that. My work is abstract for a reason, because that's the way I choose to grapple with things that are happening in the world. But I live in the world, and so I don't stand outside from it. And so working is also working within the formal constraints of a discipline is very passionate. It's not dispassionate. It's just, again, within art, it's its specific way of thinking and going about an idea or whatever is happening to you in the world.
Yeah.
Thank you. It just makes me think of what Robert Fillieux said. He was a Fluxus artist, and he said that art is what makes life more interesting than art. So.
Beautiful and spot on. So we're going to come back to Ionit here. You know, this conversation, I think, is, you know, the probity of it is really fascinating. But there's clear discussion here we should have about vanguards in art in defense of democratic order. You know, and about language as a political tool. You know, I think, and how that tool has been used by the artists you selected for this volume. Could you elaborate on the specifics of this and how you were thinking about it when you wrote your intro and assembled these artists?
For sure. I can't help but be worried about you guys in the sun.
You want to come?
Yeah, if you want to come under the shade or go back, are you okay? Okay. I'm sorry, but I'm like, just have that in mind. But please feel free to come closer, right? Because you don't need to be in the sun. Yes, but thank you, Michael, for that question. Let's see, the works I selected, I feel like overall they are either documenting or recording an event, either if it's a personal event or an event in the outside world, in their minds. And they're all very different examples. I feel like I'm still thinking about what Michelle and Dave are talking about, so excuse me if I'm not super making sense here. But to your question, Michael, I think I want to bring up a book that I recently read, and I think it was in my mind when I wrote the intro and selected these artists, which is an anthology, an edited anthology that is called Women in Concrete Poetry. And surprisingly, it's recent. Like many other endeavors, exhibitions that are focused on women that haven't been visible or celebrated in our history or in poetry. But what it's interesting to think about concrete poetry and what this book sort of open up for me is the understanding of use of language as a very fluid thing. Language that it's used as a drawing, that it's used as a diagram or a pattern on the page, that symbolizes a relationship between objects, concepts, and sometimes structures of sound. So all of the examples, I think I don't mention this in the introduction, but definitely thinking about concrete poetry, especially these examples of women in concrete poetry that don't themselves identify as poets, but they're very much working with all these things I mentioned. They are all concerned with not only the linguistic materials, but also the relationship of words with the space, and the space in this case is the page, right? So I'm doing a number of things, which is the page. So the works are not necessarily made to be seen on a publication, but by being in the publication, then I'm inviting this other relationship with the page, right? Like Dianna's works, I mean, you haven't thought about them to be, I mean, they have a lot of material involved in them, so that's obviously not in here. But just the dialectical tension that is between the page, or the page/space and language. So I can perhaps give like one example, which is very different from Dianna's work, and also very different from Margarita Paxa's work, the Me cortaron las manos, which is a work on a building, so in a public space by Nick Cave and Bob Faust. That, like Margarita Paxa's works, Margarita was working under a dictatorship and trying to avoid censorship, and by that, any work, like you're saying, by making art or artwork, especially at that time, is courageous, right? Or I see it as brave, as a political act. But she was trying to avoid censors and testing different grounds. So I relate her work with Nick Cave and Wolf Faust, which in a way is much more direct. They install in black letters and made of vinyl, "Truth Be Told," right after, well, it was last summer, 2020, kind of in response to political violence that was happening at the time, and many people in the town of upstate New York were trying to close it down or censor it, and there was a fight to keep it up. So there's that fight for art making or being truthful or saying something is not over, which that's a little bit what I try to do with these juxtapositions of works of different times.
We should note that Bob Faust also designed the journal, so we have that connection, and the mural that's in 3 parts installed. But to sort of close out the back and forth a little bit, you know, Dianna, as a Mexican-born artist, I want to center the transition from this discussion with you on this notion of exclusionary cultural forces that make such attitudes possible from your own perspective, and how you've incorporated language into your artistic process and response. You know, if you go to.
So as you can tell, English is my second language, but it is I call it my stepmother language, and it is my stronger language, because I had only been an adult in English. Well, kind of. I've tried to go back to Mexico to be an adult in Spanish too. The appearance of language in my work appeared in artist books, and I wanted to find a way to bring, I mean, it's more like the way, the method found me to bring the words out of the page. And my practice of making artist books, for me, it's a non-negotiable practice of love. You know, it's a love, I think it's an important ground to stand on when you make work. And books for me are that, so the words started to come out of the books, and now they seem to, for a while, have been a prevalent aspect of my work. I work a lot with textiles, and the reality is that text is already in textile. The roots of text and textile are in Latin to weave. So when we're wearing a piece of woven cloth, we're wearing, in a sense, a text. And that comes from the coded aspects that historically textiles have had, and that denote where someone is from. We don't have that anymore, but we have other ways of tribal coding in what we wear. Sometimes it's more explicit with like a baseball team or whatever. But, so I think maybe because language, I occupy 2 languages. I love 2 languages, and I think that part of that thing of wanting to look at language from inside, from outside, from underneath. My work as an artist has been mostly in English, but there was a period when I was working on a project in Mexico that I started to work in Spanish, and I like that sense of freedom, that I can go back and forth and work in 2 languages. But like I said, there is this part of my work that at the core will be non-linguistic. And I think that that's also important, that it evades it being pinning out. It means this. That I'm not interested in that.
Yeah, the indeterminacy seems to be the thing, right? In some respects.
I don't know if it's in the indeterminacy. It's just the excess, the overflow. Yeah.
I know Ionit, that you wanted to discuss some of the Spanish language use in Dianna's work. I don't know.
I think
that gets
Dianna
it.
talked about it, which is the projects that use Spanish, and I think she responded beautifully.
Okay.
But
All right. So,
Michael?
yeah, feel free.
I just want to respond to Dianna. I love what you said about textile having a language already in it, because Dave always laughs when artists say, "Oh, my work is site-specific," and he's like, "What are you talking about? Try being in architecture. It's all site-specific." Like you never. So I really like that there's already language in that textile. I think that's true.
So I wanted to wrap up the conversation. I think one of the things that comes up in the journal again and again and again, and as a background to a lot of this is about art and individual human rights. I think that's sort of the umbrella concept, joining all these different types of thinking about art making in the volume and in the project of assembly zones. So I wanted to have an open floor discussion about this with each of you for however long we have left, and discuss how artists are often caught up on the front lines of speech, and especially come under fire in authoritarian societies, as you mentioned, Ionit. And we've talked about that in the run-up to your article. Like, do we talk about the gauchos? Do we talk about where are these instances? Including in the U.S. And so what does that dismantling the systems of oppression look like through art in each of your perspectives? Again, a big multi-partite question, but I think it really is like, how do you respond to what, if we're making art in a social moment, and that social moment includes some oppression of voices, how do you call that out? How do you take that apart? How do you prevent it from doing its work? And,
just really briefly, I think it's the use of language is the trickiest in these moments of political oppression. Generally, or what I've seen in my studies, especially during dictatorships, is that the first attack is on works that utilize text and kind of are used either for another purpose or to be punished and censored. So the written word, I think, over history has been especially attacked. So,
yeah, go ahead.
And I've been reading the book Women of 9th Street, which is about the abstract expressionist women, and there's this scene where Barnett Newman and Helen Frankenthaler, who were at the time married, traveled to Spain and. Yeah. Did I say that? What did I say? Barnett Newman. Yeah. Sorry. Thank you. I'm getting there's. Yeah. No. Thank you. I married her someone, Bob Motherwell, and he's showing a painting in Spain. It's an abstract painting, but the title is Ode to the Spanish Republic. And just with the title itself, it was censored. It ended up being shown, but Franco didn't like the title. Sorry, I'm just saying something that was a political statement in the title to the loss of the Spanish Republic. So it's not just written word, it's the perception of the censoring mechanisms that make artists dangerous.
Right, we're talking about pronouns a lot now. I mean, we're talking about shifts in identification and shifts in how we greet and welcome each other and interact with each other. So, I mean, those things are, I think, front of mind for most people these days, I think, who are thinking about that stuff. You know, and there's obviously a lot of pushback against it as a baseline. Like, we shouldn't be able to use language about ourselves, which I find odd to even continue. Yeah, so that there are these constraints on language. So I take that, and you know, I can't remember the name of the poet, but you know, there was a poet just recently arrested in Russia. Ilya Kaminsky mentioned on one of his updates recently, and talk about journalists and how they're often run to ground as well for publishing articles that people don't like. But I think there's some sort of idea about art that I have, perhaps, which is that it persists as this zone of freedom, as a free space, both, you know, not to sort of ascribe to any over-the-top free speech movements that include violence, things like that. But you know, I do think that there's this sort of push and pull over language as a way to articulate who we are as a people, who we are as a society, and who gets recognized in those delineations. And so I keep going back to it. I sort of feel like it's an open question. It seems like it doesn't really quite ever change. There's always this pushback and forth in democratic societies, and then you have these sort of outrages that happen when it's less of a free society. But in art, I think to some degree or another, just making the work is probably, it's the ultimate answer. Just making the work is an act of defense of freedom, defense of these sort of democratic ideals. I know we're all sort of baking to death, so we're going to wrap it up. Thank you all for coming, for the whole program, some of us, and for enduring this oppressively hot summer day.
Thank you, Michael, so much for your work. And all of you, Dave, Dianna, and Michelle.
Thanks to the audience. Yeah,
I don't even know how.
My goodness.
Yeah.
I hope you had to retreat to the shade. No, I would have retreated it from the get-go.
You were just